Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to share this project with you. So this is joined with two amazing students at Harvard, Roberto Colarietti and Pier Francesco May. So our method here that I want to introduce before we even get into the topic is something that I think we economists are often quite skeptical about, which is surveys. But I want to give you just a 30-second overview why I think this is something that can be incredibly useful for us, for macroeconomists, for economists more broadly. We've used surveys for a really long time for just measurement and statistics. And for that, we now have actually a lot of high quality admin data. So, to measure things like unemployment, incomes, etc., we don't really need surveys anymore. But there's many things that remain completely invisible in data that's not survey data, no matter how great that is. Things like perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, reasoning. And often we lack, data for our revealed preference approach, which we tend to prefer as economists. And we have this tool, which is surveys, to really go more directly into these issues and be able to ask people more directly. And when you design a survey, you're really creating your own identifying variation to uncover these invisible things. So in this talk, I want to apply it to a very long-standing macro question. So the first goal of this paper will be to estimate some key parameters for macro. In particular, it's going to be intertemporal marginal propensities to consume and intertemporal marginal propensities to deleverage out of income shocks. So using this approach with hypothetical scenarios is going to allow us to recover estimates that are really hard to obtain using just existing observational data and variation. So we can have a lot of variation here that is hard to do in a controlled way in the data, such as vary the size of the shock, the timing of the shock, the sign of the shock, the source. All of this could be done in a nicely controlled way here, but of course, hypothetically, and I'll come back to this in a second. And then we can study heterogeneity in a much more granular way, not just characteristics that we might see in other data like income and assets and liquidity, but also really difficult to get things like your past experiences, your perceptions, what are your goals, your constraints, things that you can ask people directly, but that are difficult to see in other data sets. And so I mentioned the word hypothetical. We're going to put people in front of hypothetical scenarios and ask them what they're going to do. So you might be very worried at this term and might wonder, can we really trust survey respondents to say, what they would do in hypothetical situations? Does that actually mirror what they would do? So let me start right away, jump into this issue. So what we do in the paper as a first pass is to do this exercise that we call cross-validation, to basically show that surveys can be reliable for understanding how people might react in real economic situations. So what we do is we give participants scenarios that are very similar to a range of studies, which are listed in this table. So you have all the papers on the left that estimate some MPC, some MPD out of different shocks. So we put people in very similar situations, hypothetically, describing very much the setting that was used in this paper and asking them, if they were in that situation, how they would respond. And then we have in the last two columns, the value that the paper estimates, and then what people in the survey say they would do compared to that estimate. So what we can see for each cross-validation exercise, the reference paper, the target estimate, the sample, and our survey estimate. So let's pick an example. For instance, the first line has Christina Patterson's paper. So she estimates the MPC out of income losses due to unemployment. So due to a large and persistent decline in personal income, she uses the PSID and the CEX. And so in our survey, we will present respondents with a hypothetical scenario where we ask them, if you lost their job and as a consequence, this share of your income, exactly matching that study, by how much would you reduce consumption in this time frame? And you see our estimate on average among respondents really matches what's seen in the observational data. So this is not the same people, of course, but it is a sort of validation that across a whole range of settings that you can see in this table, survey responses can be reliable predictors of your behavior. And why is that? And is that always true? Definitely not. I think it really depends on the setting and what you're asking about. So here, what we're asking about is situations, that are very close to the ordinary, right? So these are things which people are used to thinking about, trade-offs that they're used to making. So I think this accuracy comes from focusing on really daily decisions, like for instance, handling an unexpected $500 shock, not daily, but weekly, monthly, something happens. People know how to think through these situations, rather than extremely rare life-changing events like winning $1 million in the lottery, in which case it's hard to think that people might be able to predict correctly what you would do in this completely out of the ordinary situation. So our takeaway here is that for things that are grounded in everyday experience, people can quite accurately predict their reactions. And for everyday decisions, for spending decisions, this to us says that this type of surveys can be a really valuable tool to anticipate responses in macro and policy settings. So that was a lot just to get this out of the way, since I'm going to present results and everything, that I think we can really trust these estimates. The second goal of the paper is quite different. It's what we call model selection, which is, several models can be observationally equivalent when you look at the data, especially given the limited data we have. For instance, we see a range of MPCs out there. There's many models that can rationalize them. So one thing that our survey allows us to do is to ask people more directly about what you could call their mental model of reasoning or spending, their functioning model. So we can ask them, for each, let's say, income shock, what are your specific adjustment margins you will use? Will you deleverage? Will you repay late bills? Will you pay your mortgage, etc.? We can ask them about their motivations and reasons. Why do you choose to do this versus why do you not choose to do this? Like, why do you choose to save in response to this? Why do you not save more? Why do you spend this? Why do you not spend more? And then it can also help us rationalize some puzzles. So the combination of the parameter estimates from the first goal and these underlying motivations can actually help us shed light on some puzzles, which I guess we call puzzles because we don't really understand households' reasons in the first place. And here we can more directly ask about them. So this is what we're going to do in this paper, what I'm hoping to cover. And please, of course, feel free to jump in with questions as we go. So let me introduce a little bit the survey and the sample. Let me start with the sample. So I'm going to be relatively brief since it's a brief talk, but in general, the way these surveys work is that they are run through commercial survey companies. So these companies typically run surveys for businesses and market research purposes, which is really great for a few purposes. First, they have really broad pools of respondents and different ways of rewarding people for their time in a way that they can attract different sorts of people, for instance, also some higher income people. So they will provide, not only cash responses, which might not be that attractive to higher income people, but also through partnerships, they'll give frequent flyer miles or hotel points for stores, for airlines, for hotels. So this allows them to get some more high income respondents, which would otherwise be impossible to just incentivize with cash rewards or prohibitively expensive. So all in all, these surveys, although you never get either the very top of the distribution or the very bottom of the income distribution, you can think of it as having a good representation in a broad, solid middle of the population. And, I can show you the tables. You can see them in the paper too, but along many characteristics, the samples are nicely representative. There's quotas that we impose so that by construction, they'll be representative on income, gender, race, broad regions. And then we can check that they're also very representative on employment, employment status, family situations, etc. And then one other thing that's interesting is in terms of the assets, which is something we ask in great detail about here. So we can see like a lot of characteristics on the assets that also match, pretty well. Again, you don't get the really, really rich people, but if you look at the median, for instance, you're very close to the medians in the data on many things like primary residence, checking accounts balances, credit card balances, etc. So the survey flow, just very, very briefly again. So roughly, the survey will have these two big parts matching the two goals. First, there's going to be a more quantitative elicitation. So that's what's represented here. So after asking people a lot of questions about their socioeconomic background, their household finances, decision-making process, etc., we then go into randomized branches where people are going to see, either a proportional size shock, 10% of their income, or a fixed size shock, $1,000. It's going to be randomized positive, negative. It's going to be randomized whether you get it today or whether you get it in the future. So we're going to be able to randomize all these scenarios to be able to elicit what people say they will do. In the second part, it's the qualitative part. It's this model selection part where we're going to now ask people, given what shocks you have received, what will you do? More detailed, not just spend, save, but rather repay these bills, save in this account, put it in these assets. So much more detailed. And then why do you do this or why do you not do this? So let me show you the results from this first part, the quantitative estimation of IMPCs and IMPDs. So first, a little bit more detail about how we do this. So it's very challenging to try to elicit MPCs and MPDs in a survey. There's three key challenges here. One is we need to ensure that respondents understand well what is meant by saving, borrowing, deleveraging, consumption. These are terms that are clear in our models, but in the real world, it's not something that's necessarily very simple to explain. So here, as you see on this page, we start by giving a really clear definition, at least we hope it's clear, about what we mean by these terms. A second very important point is that we need to clarify that we are eliciting the incremental or additional, saving or spending responses from people. We're not interested in their inframarginal things that they would have done absent the shock. And that is surprisingly difficult to convey as well. So we're trying to, ask about this additional relative to a counterfactual. That's not obvious. And so we try to make this clear here. So we try to explain this before they're led into the questions. And third, we need to ensure consistency and simplify any computational difficulties. So we don't want, the disincentive here to be people are not able to compute things quickly enough, etc. So what we do is this interactive feature in the survey where people see the size of the either expense or extra positive shock that they can have. And they are asked to fill out for each quarter, so between today and 3 months from now, between 4 and 6 months from now, the additional spending or additional debt repayments that they plan to make. And as they fill this out, at the bottom, they can see how many savings they have left over to roll into the year after. So they can adjust this and just see how much is left over without having to make those computations. Okay, so let me dive into some results now. So first, on the intertemporal marginal propensities to consume and intertemporal marginal propensities to deleverage out of an income shock. So how to read this figure here? So in the left panel, we have the estimates of the MPCs. And on the right panel, we have the estimates of the MPDs. And each panel is split further into positive shocks on the left and negative shocks or unexpected expenses on the right. There's more info here. So the circles refer to a proportional shock. So this is scaling with the income of the respondent equivalent to 10%, so a pretty sizable shock. And the diamonds refer to a fixed shock, $1,000 for each. So note that for most households, the fixed $1,000 shock is going to be a smaller shock than the 10% proportional shock. So you can also think to some extent about small and larger shock. So we can summarize here the dynamics very briefly by reporting both the quarter MPC, so let's call this the impact MPC, that's in solid blue or red, and then the cumulative MPC over the first year, so summing the first 4 quarters. And then I'll show you the full quarter by quarter dynamics, which are also interesting below. So in our data, following a positive income shock of $1,000, the average impact MPC in 1 quarter is 0.16. And then it's much lower in the subsequent quarters. So overall, the cumulative is 0.42 over the first year. And then quite a bit of it goes into deleveraging too. So on impact, the impact MPD is 0.25 and then cumulatively 0.45. So people do a lot of deleveraging here. And we can benchmark
Stefanie?
this. Yes.
Yes, we have a question from
Sure.
Sigal Ribon. Just before the question, I just want to interrupt you and congratulate you for winning the Bates Clerk Medal.
Oh, thank you.
That is just now, we learned that from Twitter. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So first of all, congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
Just a small question concerning the survey itself. Did you try to compare between answers of people when you ask them about a proportional or fixed? Because you know the income, so-called income, as it is reported, so you can derive the proportional shock for people that you asked them concerning fixed shock. You know, people like $1,000 or 10% of people that have an income of $10,000. Is there any effect of the way you asked? Actually, my question is there effect that you found because of the way you
Yes,
phrased the question?
absolutely. So this is why we consistently have this, fixed shock and 10% shock. So one that scales, one that is fixed. And you see on this graph that there are small differences. So if you compare the circles, which are the proportional shock, to the diamonds, which are the fixed shock, then you can see that there are differences, there. And this relates, what I was going to say is you can compare this to estimates in the literature. So there's a nice table in the paper comparing to existing MPCs and MPDs. And you can see that in general, for smaller shocks, they're larger MPCs, and that's kind of aligned here. But your question also makes me think about another thing, which is in the paper, you'll see that we have a section that explains that things will become sensitive to how you ask because you're putting people in a different frame. So for instance, if you ask allocate quarter by quarter in the first year versus, and then everything in the second year at once versus allocate for 8 quarters, you will see differences. There will be these horizon effects that appear. So we show it's very consistent for the first year, but then you'll see differences. And so it's important to think about either providing bounds or randomizing how you ask to have this more robust estimates, because these horizon effects will matter to people because they're projecting themselves at different horizons. So yeah, great question. And here you can basically see this difference between proportional and fixed. And I think it's really useful to say that this is actually really in line with existing evidence. And that's nice because we have lots of estimates of short-term MPCs. So it's nice that those align. But we have really not much extensive evidence on negative shocks or on MPDs, quite a bit. So extrapolating from the fact that MPCs match very well what we know, I think we can now get much more valuable information on other things which we don't know from other data, like MPDs, negative shocks, variations in the sizes of the shocks. So, to summarize here, I think a few results. One is that cumulative MPCs over the first year will be much larger from the impact MPCs. So many people will not spend it right away, but ultimately over the year, a lot will be gone into deleveraging or spending. Smaller shocks, as we just said, have larger MPCs. There is an asymmetry that's also been documented before where negative shocks have larger MPCs. People tend to buffer their downside more than sort of use up the upside. And on the flip side, they also have smaller MPDs. And one thing that I'll emphasize over and over is that MPCs are really not the whole story here. MPDs plays a huge role too. They're really important. You see they're quite large. At this point in time, this is US households, a lot goes into debt repayments. So they're really important. And actually, we'll see this a little bit in the talk and you'll see it in the paper. MPDs have much more variation across socioeconomic groups. So the spending is less different across people, but the propensity to repay your loans, take out loans, borrow is very, very different across people. I think there's a question. I see a hand up.
Yes, we have a question from Fred Jawadi.
Yeah, Thank you so much, Stefanie, for this nice talk. My question is more about the sample. If I understood it, so you conducted between 2022 and 2023, right? But we
Yes.
know that period is like an abnormal period, high inflation, high uncertainty, post-COVID, and so on. Do you think that this context could impact the allocation of the income? How do people? Okay,
Yes.
I receive an additional income, but I feel that the situation is not normal enough,
Yes.
so I'm going to behave differently. How did you
Great.
control for that?
That's a great question. And so there's really no way to control except to redo it at multiple times. You're completely right. So we actually did in 2020, 2021, a first wave, and the MPCs were much smaller because people were potentially receiving a lot of government support during that time. You're completely right. So those results for comparison are in the appendix. And then we redid this, 3 years later, which is the results I'm showing you here, and we can actually see that time series. So the context absolutely matters. And what's nice is that we can, this is a flexible tool. So I think if we think about policymakers specifically, this is clearly not something that should be done and then not done for 10 years again, but rather it's something that can be deployed regularly to sort of gauge how our current MPC is looking, how our current MPD is looking. So I think it's very important to look at that context, and we see it even over the course of 4 years here.
Thank you.
Great. So then I wanted to also tell you a little bit about the more detailed dynamic path, because that's something that is a value here, to be able to go quarter by quarter. So although we saw a lot of the results too, but we can actually look at the full dynamic path here. So what's depicted on this figure here? So the left panel again looks at MPCs, and the right panel looks at MPDs. The different colored and textured lines show different timing for when the shock is received. So red solid is income is received right now, so unexpected right now. The blue dashed is received in Q2, and the green dotted received in Q3, but anticipated. So do things look different when people are anticipating it? So for MPCs, you see very clearly there's the largest effect on impact. So for instance, if you get it in Q1 has the biggest MPC, then it declines. If you get it in Q2 has the biggest MPC, then it declines. So that's a first key result. You can also see that there's significant anticipation. So for a household that expects to receive something in Q2, there is already a response in Q1. Similarly, for a household that expects to receive it in Q3. And this is true for many households, except if you look at households that are really, really constrained, households who say they're really close to their constraints all the time, you see for them, they can only react when they actually get the shock. So around 35% of households are completely unable to anticipate a positive shock. So if we look at conditional being able to anticipate, there's much more smoothing. But this is on average in the population. For MPDs on the right, you can see much, much sharper on impact and much less anticipation. So put differently, people cannot start deleveraging ahead of time before a shock, which makes sense. And they deleverage a lot on impact. And so on the next slide, if we consider the same, the same figure, exactly the same figure, but for negative shocks now, you see that anticipation is much larger for negative shocks. Again, this asymmetry comes. People are trying to buffer their downside. So people start cutting spending and delaying repaying debts ahead of time for negative shocks. And you see the lines are much closer together regardless of the timing of the shock. So when people know something bad is coming, they're trying to react to it, as opposed to this heterogeneity we saw here for positive shocks, where on impact is much stronger. So this is something nice to see in these dynamic responses. Another thing that, as I alluded to, we can do is to look at more detailed heterogeneity in MPCs or MPDs for different characteristics. So the first MPCs is easy. A lot of info has already been looked at, but again, for MPDs, it's quite lacking, the evidence. So let's start with something very easy, which is by quintiles of liquid wealth, which is something that has been looked at a lot and is quite a salient characteristic. So this figure shows you to the left here the MPCs, and to the right the MPDs by quintiles of wealth. So quintile 1 is the lowest wealth quintile, quintile 5 is the highest wealth quintile. And so in each panel, again, we can see the 1 quarter impact MPC, sort of on impact, that's the red circles, or the cumulative over a year, that's the blue square, and we have the sample average, that's the dashed vertical lines. So you can see that actually for MPCs on the left, regardless of your wealth quintile, on impact, they're pretty much the same. If anything, they're slightly higher for higher wealth quintiles, but it's very similar. There's actually, when you look over the year, that's when you see that there is a difference where higher wealth households have higher MPCs. So we'll come back to that little puzzle here, but it's already been documented in other work. So our intuition that it's the lowest wealth households that will spend more is not borne out here, and we'll talk about why that's the case. And part of the response is in the right panel, which is look at MPDs here. They show the biggest heterogeneity, both on impact and cumulatively over the year. So what we see is that they're significantly lower for higher wealth households. So what's happening is that low liquidity households, when they receive a positive shock, focus a lot on debt repayments, both immediately and over the year. And so the spending margin is much more muted in heterogeneity. Is the deleveraging margin that is very different across households. And this is something we'll encounter again when we talk about some puzzles and we combine it with the reasons why households, adjust the way they do. And I can preview this already now. Why do MPCs not decline more as we move to higher wealth quintiles for a positive shock? Well, because people spend for very different reasons. Low liquidity constrained households tend to spend because they need things. High liquidity households in our data will say that they spend because they like to splurge. They like to buy high quality things when they have more, or because they're saving for long-term goals. And so they are what's called term liquidity constraint. They're not strictly liquidity constrained, but since they're saving for that goal, most of their liquidity is stashed away, like for college or for retirement. And so they actually enjoy some unexpected cash. So accordingly, you can see that, there's very, very different reactions when you get some extra. And, you can also see for liquidity, which is another interesting type of heterogeneity that I want to focus here, that there's some interesting patterns. So what I want to show you here is that liquidity is just a snapshot in time, right? And here's another place where the value of survey data comes into play again. Because you can ask, why is a household low liquidity in the first place, right? Well, at least two reasons. They can either have had negative shocks recently that have caused them to be low liquidity today. They may generally have lower income, so it might be a usual situation. Or it could be a characteristic, like maybe they're impatient or lack self-control, and that's why they always have low liquidity. And so what the slide shows here, it zooms in on low liquidity households only, but then distinguishes between those who are impatient or with low self-control, those who have had past negative experiences recently, so defined as self-reported worsening in the household economic conditions over the past 2 years. And then we can also distinguish between those who have low income, and then that's business as usual, so no negative recent experience. So basically, they're generally low income, and households who are low income today, but actually it is because they just had some negative shocks that happen. So who happen to be surveyed at a time of unusually low income. So you can see all these different situations. And again, you see the biggest differences in the MPDs here. So impatient households tend to have higher MPCs, makes sense, and lower MPDs than those who had recent negative experiences, which might be why they have low liquidity to start with. And furthermore, among those who are low income, those who are doing temporarily worse have lower MPCs and higher MPDs than those who are usually low income. So this is, something valuable that we can see in terms of just looking at liquidity, doesn't provide the full picture because we don't know why people are, low liquidities to start with. And, this brings me to another point, which is that differences in MPCs and MPDs are really not well explained by socioeconomic factors alone. So you can see this in the paper, and I don't want to bore you with too many details here. But if you try to regress things like, the MPCs on your whole range of wealth, income, characteristics, etc., you get pretty low R-squared. It's very hard to explain this. When you add things like information on worries, on constraints, on experiences, on plans, on aspirations, it improves the R-squared quite a lot. So this example of households, with low liquidity shows you that they can have very different MPCs and MPDs based on their specific circumstances. So just putting in low liquidity as a control is really not going to help you get much mileage here. So that's on that whole first part. Are there any questions here before I dive into the...
I have a question from Fred Jawadi.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe a question about the memory effect and the allocation. Can the model Can the model control for that? Because most likely we're looking at the dynamic of the conception. We point what we call the memory effect. People behave, they allocate, and they're going to behave in the same way. So can the model control for that? Can you test whether to see whether people switch in their allocation or they follow the same behavior?
So we don't really I couldn't entirely understand your question, whether you're asking me whether we have the asset allocation that people have currently, because we know.
For example, I receive an additional income.
Yes.
I'm going to reallocate this income. Okay, I'm going to save more or maybe to spend more. Okay. Next period or next month, if I'm going to receive, for example, another addition, am I going to behave with the same manner or I'm going to switch? I don't know whether the model does control for that or not. We have
Right. So we don't currently we don't currently ask them, repeatedly hear the same people.
Okay.
But that would be very interesting to do. So absolutely, I agree.
To capture what we call it the inertia effect.
Good. Yes, I mean, you can sort of see it here I think in the dynamic path. We can look at more within household what they do. We could, at least for the first few quarters, we could ask them, since we asked them about that. Yeah, great point. Thank you. Okay, so now turning to the second part, which is this model selection. So here we're interested in eliciting the reasons behind household behaviors. So we see how they behave quantitatively, but how can we know why they do this? So we start by repeating these scenarios for positive and negative shocks, and then we ask them about many relevant potential detailed adjustment margins. So instead of just spending, saving, we'll ask, for instance, I will purchase basic necessities and items we need that we cannot currently afford. I'll put money into our emergency fund. We'll repay late bills that we wouldn't normally pay without this extra money. We'll put more money towards our long-term goals, like house purchases, education, etc. So much more detailed adjustment margin. And then we're going to ask about much more detailed reasons for doing, or not doing more of something. So I can show you here. Here, for instance, reasons that we offer people. So, for instance, top left panel. Why would you increase spending? Because you're staying for long-term goals, because you just want to, you don't want to have to think about how to spend this money. So you're sort of on autopilot to save it. You like to splurge. You're on autopilot to spend it. You like to splurge. You have needs. You planned a lumpy purchase, something big, and now this money allows you to do it. You worry about inflation. You lack self-control. That's not exactly how we phrase it, but that's what we mean. Like people just don't want to wait. Why do you not increase spending by more on the top right? Because you have concerns about the future, because you want to, smooth your consumption, you have your habits already, because you don't need anything, because it's easier to just not do it. Why do you repay debt? Why do you not repay debt? Why do you save? Why do you not save more? Also hours of work, which is another relevant margin. Why do you cut your hours? Why do you not cut your hours? So these are just examples of the reasons that people can give, and households can give several reasons, of course, for doing something or not doing something. And then we can use a machine learning algorithm, which is called a latent class analysis, or LCA, to basically let the algorithm identify types in the data. So based on responses that tend to go together, which types appear? Households that tend to answer similarly to all of these questions about reasons. That helps us say these are the clusters of households that appear. And so this is where I want to show you on this mega slide that's very clustered, but essentially the key results from this clustering algorithm. So when you put together people's MPCs, people's reasonings, people's adjustment margins, what comes out is these 4 key types. So they're labeled in the columns. We have the strongly constrained households. They're around 18% of the sample. We have the spenders. They're around a third of the sample. We have the precautionary households. They're 16%. And we have what we call the quasi-smoothers, which are 18%. So some of these will sound a little bit familiar and others not so much. So what are the strongly constrained households? These are households whose, each row shows you some sort of characteristics of these households. So for instance, the sizes of their MPCs, MPDs after a positive shock relative to the average, or after a negative shock relative to the sample average. What is their main response margin after a positive shock and their main reason for it? What's their main response after a negative shock and their reason for it? What are some decision-making characteristics? What are some main socioeconomic characteristics or other characteristics? So I think the table provides basically all the info, but the strongly constrained are what you might imagine, which are people who are in general, low income, lower asset types. But what's interesting is their main reactions is really to deleverage after a positive shock. And after a negative shock, their reaction is mainly to, try to cut spending and also borrow. So they're really distinguished a lot by this borrowing and deleveraging margin. A lot of their action is on the debt side. They don't actually have very high MPCs, contrary to what might we think. They actually have high MPDs often. And their main reasons for their actions are generally, that they have too many debts. So when they have a positive shock, they try to repay them. On the negative side, they have a lot of future concerns, and so they're worried. They have to cut spending and borrow extra. They substitute towards lower quality goods. They often cannot borrow even more. Often we ask them, a lot about their decision-making characteristics, like at what horizon they plan, how they plan, and they report typically that they can handle only very limited unexpected expenses. They're often unable to stick to plans because of volatility and shocks, and they typically have a very short planning horizon, like in the terms of weeks at most up to a month. So no really long-term planning or goals. They tend to actually have a lot of concerns, high income risk, high income volatility. The spenders are very, very different in the second column. The spenders, basically, their main response is to spend. So after a positive shock, they try to spend. And the reason that they do that is because it's just easiest. They're trying to minimize cognitive burden. They're sort of busy. They're often younger with children, have higher income and assets, low income risk. So they don't care too much about spending extra. They like to splurge, which means, buying higher quality things, treating themselves. And then after a negative shock, when they have a negative shock, they have a mix of spending cuts, borrowing, dipping a bit into their savings. For them, it's relatively easy to borrow, and they just generally don't put too much into their financial decisions. They are really into minimizing the cognitive burden. They're able to withstand, pretty average unexpected expenses. They typically have lower self-control, low risk aversion. The precautionary are also somewhat familiar from our standard models. So the precautionary are, their main response after a positive shock is to save, and after a negative shock is to cut consumption and, if needed, dip into their savings. So they're really these careful type. They have high self-control. They have really high planned investments. They have a lot of future concerns, and because of that, they have a big buffer stock for such situations. They have really large planned investments. They stick to plans in a quite disciplined manner. So they tend to be also a little bit older, higher assets. They have low debts. So these are your careful precautionary types. And then we have the quasi-smoothers, which are, I would say relatively familiar to us, but they're not entirely smoothers. So like smoothers, they're going to buffer when bad things happen. They're going to dip into their savings when they get a negative shock. But unlike the smoothers in our model, and that's why we call them quasi-smoothers, when they have a positive shock, yes, they save mainly, but they also spend quite a bit. They have quite high MPCs. And again, it's because they tend to have long-term goals, and so they're term liquidity constrained. Like they're saving for college, they're saving for retirement, so they too enjoy some extra cash. They have really long planning horizons. They're able to withstand unexpected shocks. So they're pretty, they're in a pretty good place. So these are the 4 different types of households that appear. And again, they sound familiar to some extent from our models, but they might behave in more unexpected ways than what the most standard models predict. And actually, we tried to write a model that could nest all these types. And you'll see that it's only in the appendix, because as soon as you try to match, let's say 3 of the types, something will break with the 4th type. Something will not be okay with the 4th type. So there's really a challenge in our existing models to incorporate all these different modes of functioning of households. So we couldn't get all the way there, but I think this very much calls for trying to use this information about these different types that are out there, these different models of functioning, to actually, build a model that can accommodate for this. Because you see, they act completely differently and for very different reasons. So they cannot be represented by one thing only. Let me skip this in the interest of time and jump to this final part, which is, well, can we? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. I see in the papers that you are controlling high education, but
Yes.
when I see this table, yeah, exactly. When I see this table, I'm wondering if having assets or being richer or having money educate myself in a way to know what's happened when I will receive money and
Right.
to know what to do. So is there a way to control on the type of education? Maybe if you have a financial education or something like that?
Yes, that's a great question. So actually, we do ask about the field of study, and we couldn't find a strong effect, so we left it out. It could be just, in this sample, it doesn't have big of an effect, or people, just few people have an economics education, for instance. But one of my co-authors, Christopher Fidberg, has some excellent work in Denmark, where he actually uses, cutoffs in admissions to university, and to see if people got into their first choice, like business degree or economics related degree, and then looks at their financial choices later, in particular, in terms of having debt and other financial decisions in the actual admin data. And he did find that there was an effect. So people who had more economics, business related degrees take, in his world, quote unquote, better financial decisions. So that was there. We couldn't see too much here. And just to be clear, in our case, it's not clear that there's such a thing as a better or worse financial decisions. So we're basically looking what people do as a function of their background. But yeah, great question. I think there's another hand up.
Yes, we have a question from Juan Camilo Laborde. Vera?
Thank you very much for the paper. It's very insightful and very interesting. So I recently saw this paper where the design of the income shock mattered a lot in terms of, for example, in some papers, they gave people like a credit card, but it was limited in time. So they said you can only spend the money for the next 3 weeks, or after a month the money will not be available anymore, so that incentivized people to front load the spending.
Right.
And but there were still some people that didn't spend the money, but that definitely led to higher IMPCs. Have you tried to ask people these type of questions?
So no, we did not force them to spend the money in a given amount of time. So we randomized what I showed you earlier. So the size of the shock, the timing, so whether it's immediate or in which quarter it's received. And we also, which means anticipated, non-anticipated. And we also asked them about the source of the shock, but I'm not showing you this here because in practice it didn't matter too much. So we did not randomize, oh, this is only available for the year. In fact, people could very much choose to save some for the year after. And you see that based on the sizes of the MPCs and MPDs, people do leave something for the year after, especially from the larger shock.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. So the last thing in the last few minutes that I wanted to show you is this this question of using this combination of the qualitative answers and the quantitative answers to explain some puzzles. So some puzzles that are out there. And I'll do this very briefly verbally here. So one puzzle that's out there is, why do constrained households have, let's say, surprisingly low MPCs, where surprisingly is relative to our existing standard models. And we saw this in multiple places in the talk. They mostly focus on deleveraging. So that might not be, a law of nature, but in the current environment, these households are actually very, very heavily leveraged. And so their focus is on, whenever they can, deleverage rather than spend. So this is why you see so much of the action on the MPDs rather than on the MPCs. Another big question or puzzle out there is, on the flip side, well, why do high liquid households, this puzzle, why do liquid households have high MPCs? Don't they already have liquidity. And we see in the data, and you can see it in more detail, in the paper, that they tend to spend on leisure and more luxurious items because they enjoy splurging, or because they're saving for big expenses in the future. And so they're effectively not today liquidity constrained, but they're term liquidity constrained. Basically, they know that there's something big coming up for which they need to save, so extra cash is actually relaxing their term constraint. Another puzzle is, why do households respond asymmetrically to positive and negative shocks? And here we see very different answers for different households, again, showing the importance of these more granular reasons. It's not the same reason for everyone. So the asymmetric types are really the precautionary ones, on the one hand. So these people tend to smooth consumption after a positive shock, but they tend to cut spending after a negative. So they're very asymmetric. And this is because they worry about the future. So they always try to save, to channel things into their savings and to ensure themselves for the future. They're just very worried. And so that's why they're going to behave asymmetrically, not enjoy the upside and try to buffer their downside. The others that are somewhat asymmetric are the spenders and the quasi-smoothers. So they increase spending when things are good out of a desire to indulge and splurge whenever possible, but they will smooth out the negative shocks because they can. So they will also behave asymmetrically for completely different reasons than, say, the precautionary ones. So again, you see that the same, a same observed behavior can just be explained by very different things. And that's why it's important to dig into the actual reasons for why households do or do not do something. And so to me, the key takeaway here to conclude is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the models households use to react. So I think our analysis reacts that you might do the same thing, as in you might have the same MPC for very different reasons. And observational data that just gives us adjustments in spending, debt, or saving will give us very limited info about the underlying model that households follow. So it will have very limited predictive power for identifying types. So other info that can be useful gleaned from surveys, but not sufficient: the size of the MPCs, MPDs, these more specific adjustment margins, for instance, using credit card debt versus leaving bills unpaid. That's already giving a bit more information. Detailed socioeconomic characteristics such as assets or income, of course, they give information. Concerns, goals, plans, are quite predicted, but not sufficiently so, because many households do have shared concerns and aspirations. And really, the key info you need is the underlying reasons for choosing specific behaviors. So I hope that was some takeaway here. And with that, I'll leave you to ask me questions, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefanie, for this great presentation and paper. So we have one question from Ariel Karlinski.
Hi. This was super interesting. I was wondering, are you familiar with Valerie Ramey's work on, MPCs that don't really pass the sniff test in macroeconomic models?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it was one of the papers whose estimates we tried to match. Yes.
Okay, so do you have anything to say about this sort of puzzle?
So I think we focused on these. I think we could have something to say with a new survey. So here we basically tried to, we targeted some puzzles just out of space constraint and time constraint, which was basically these three. There's one more, which is the co-holding puzzle, which is why households both at the same time hold debt, pretty high interest debt, and then yet not repay that debt, but actually spend, etc. And we couldn't get too much mileage on that one. You'll see in the paper, it's the one where we had most trouble explaining it. Probably we're not hitting the right reasons why people might want to do it. Most often they say they just want to keep some cash, regardless, just for safety. It seems like this is. And then there's a small share that actually says, I didn't realize I had these high interest debts while also holding that money. So there were also some inter-household issues. But so these are mainly the puzzles we focused. But I think with this methodology, it would be great to think about many more settings where, we have super interesting estimates, great empirical papers, and something about the mechanism is unclear to us economists. This is exactly, I think, a use case for why we might want to go and dig in to understand this further.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question, Ariel. We have another question from Fred Jawadi.
Yeah, thank you. I have a small question about the gender. If we look at your at the different groups, for example, people that you call the spenders.
Yeah.
So in this group, do we have more women, more men to see
Great
whether
question. Yeah. So I think here, so I tried to skip this, but so in the paper you can see the cut in two ways. So one is if you look at by characteristic, so for instance, among male respondents at the very top, what share is going to be spenders, strongly constrained, precautionary, quasi-smoother. I don't have here the flip chart, which is in the paper too, which is within each cluster, how many are female, etc. But here you can basically compare relative to the sample, overall sample share, which is at the bottom. So you see spenders are somewhat more represented among men. So among men, there's disproportionately more spenders than in the overall population and proportionally fewer among female respondents. Female respondents tend to, have an overrepresentation of strongly constrained households relative to the overall population. And so you can see here by different characteristics, for instance, some of the really interesting ones to me are, the ones on the right, which are by preferences, by concerns, by plans and commitments, for instance, if they have high income risk, low income risk, by type of concerns that they have. So overall, the spenders are the biggest share in the sample, but you can see that they have different representation among different types of households.
Okay, thank you. And my last question is whether whether the same methodology what kind of result can we expect if we apply for European data?
So I think it would be super interesting, and I don't know to what extent things will be overlapping versus different. So I would be extremely interested in seeing on Israeli data, on European data, on other countries. So we only did it in the US because it's the start, I think, of this, and we were really interested in those estimates. But I would be incredibly interested to see how it looks in other countries.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the question, Fred. We have a question from Juan Camillo.
Hello, thank you very much. So your IMPCs out of anticipated, not anticipated income shocks tend to be higher at the beginning, and they fade out through time.
Right.
So, do you agree that this type of pattern is inconsistent with permanent income type models, where you increase permanently your income in a proportion for the whole future? I mean, like your results can provide discipline to test some type of model. So is this consistent with a Hank model or with a with a permanent income type model? Like, can you like talk about like what your results provide? Thank you.
So on average, it's not entirely consistent with either one. So you see that people aren't. This is a one-time shock, right? To be clear, that people get, and here, this dynamic path that I showed you is simply varying when exactly they get it. If it's announced 1 or 2 quarters in advance, or if it's unannounced today. And so you can see that there's both anticipation when you know the shock is happening, and there's also a non-smoothing. So you react more on impact, although you still react in other quarters, but you react more on impact. And so even, it's really not consistent with either of the super standard models. Now, what I wanted to emphasize is that this happens for different reasons for different households. And it's a mix. This is on average in the sample. It's a mix of what 4 completely different households do. And so this is something very, very important. For instance, the quasi-smoothers, even they don't perfectly smooth that shock, right? That's why we call them quasi-smoothers, because they like to benefit when they have something positive, because they like to splurge or because they're term liquidity constrained. So even they don't behave like the textbook smoothers that we have. And then the constrained ones, they try to deleverage instead of spending more. So they also don't necessarily behave the way we might think right away. So I think this is highlighting that we might want to extend some of the existing models. And as I said, for us, it was very difficult to nest all these 4 types in a model in a consistent way. So there's more work to be done there.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If we have any additional questions, please raise your hand. So I have my first question for you, and thank you again for presenting us this fantastic paper. So as a central banker, as a policymaker, but more as a central banker, which kind of policy recommendations could we derive from the results? I think there are some, but I want you to develop this.
Mm-hmm. So to me, this is basically showing. To me, the goal of the paper is twofold. One is to show that we can use this methodology to get at prediction for what might happen from a given policy. So I think it is showing that it can be a useful predictive tool. So maybe you don't call that a lesson for policymakers, but rather perhaps the lesson is this can be very useful to use. So we spoke at multiple times during the questions that it might be context specific, so it might make sense to do this more regularly in a specific country under a specific context, and I completely agree with that. And that's why it's flexible enough to be used that way. So I think the cross-validation exercise shows if you put people in the exact situation that you're interested in, there will be really good predictive power for what they will do. So to me, that's a first lesson. The second lesson is that we will probably have to, augment in a sense our models to account for these different modes of functioning, because there is such a fundamental heterogeneity that is not just a function of your income or your assets, but rather, a way of thinking, different preferences, different modes of functioning, and to have the richest model of, then in the aggregate of the macroeconomy, it seems like we do need to microfound these types. Who knows, in other countries, some other types might appear. So it would be very interesting to compare to what extent there's these 4 fundamental types everywhere versus there's actually, very different types that appear in other countries or contexts.
Yeah, thank you very much. Exactly, that was also one question about the cultural environment and all of these questions. I have also 2 technical questions, but my first one is, okay, so here you are using a $1,000 shock, but what would happen if you increase or decrease this amount? Let's say that tomorrow you do the same experience with 2,000 or 3,000. Will you have the same result?
Is about the transfer or the sample size? I could
not.
Yeah,
The transfer.
The size of
the
it.
amount.
The amount. Yes, no, I think I don't know if tomorrow we'll get the same results in the sense that, right, the macro environment changes and people are clearly sensitive to the macro environment. The size clearly matters. So let's say holding the environment constant, I think our results here already showed the size really matters. So this is why, as a rough cut, we went for $1,000 basically fixed, for most people, smaller shock, and 10% proportional shock that is much larger for people. And you saw on the graphs that smaller shocks have larger MPCs, which has been shown. People behave differently for these. So in an ideal world, we could do a whole gradient of shocks, much more finely staggered to see that.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a question from Anton Moisev.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. This is a brilliant presentation. And I have not so much as a question as a memory. I have seen a very similar paper made for Russia when I worked for Russian Academy of Sciences, or also on people's incomes. And when you compare different countries, the cultural background is really important. Mm-hmm. The thing that was drawn from that survey, which was not known for most experts and even those who conducted the survey, was that there was a high MPD tendencies, much higher than they expected. And although the individuals' debt to the banks was at very low levels, mm-hmm. there were many people who were indebted to communal services companies.
To what, sorry?
To communal services, to utilities.
Okay, yeah.
So people really tended to deleverage on electricity, on the arrears, on taxes.
Yes.
And they were much less eager to splurge.
Yes.
That's it.
No, that's a great comment, because it speaks very much to when you just look at savings, spending, deleveraging as broad categories. Obviously, we need to do this to aggregate things, but it obscures a lot of great information. And in the context of the US, we try to adapt the more detailed adjustment margins exactly to the current context here. So where it's a lot of credit cards, to your point, people leave bills unpaid or just keep rolling over bills. That's another way to basically, essentially borrow. So we try to ask about these things which are relevant here. And again, I completely agree. In another country, when you design this, you would have to be very careful to really include the relevant margins for that context, which are probably different. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Anton, for your question. And of course, Stefanie, for your replies. So we have another question from Etienne Fiz.
Hi, thanks. Great paper. I had a question maybe for future work, but those types you find, how much do you think they are nature or nurture? I mean, are you set with the type for life? Or as you may have shown, some types are older people or people without or with kids. And how do you could you shock with policy to get people from one type to shift to another type, to increase MPC or to whatever policy objective you have? But yeah, my question would be that.
Yeah, no, this is a great philosophical question. I think I clearly don't have the answer, and this will be, definitely for much future work, I think, until we even understand, I think, all these types better. But the fact that, the types are not, they do depend on existing characteristics, as you say, family situation, age, etc. Clearly, some of it is driven by circumstances. Now, again, people might be in these circumstances because of their type. So I think it's a very meta question that could be interesting to look at.
Thank you very much. Do we have any additional questions? Please raise your hand if you have any question. Yes, we have a question from Juan Camilo.
Yeah, so this is like a methodological question. So how can you, respond to the critics of surveys who say, you really have to have a real shock so that you can see how people really react to the shock, instead of just asking them how would they react, because people can say something on a survey, but then when you really give them the income, they can act really differently. So how can you respond to these criticisms of surveys?
Were you here for the very beginning of the talk, or when I showed the cross-validation? Okay, when I showed the cross-validation exercise, because I was trying to answer exactly that question. So, in very brief, we basically show that if you there's all this existing empirical work, right, that shows what people actually do. For instance, after an unemployment shock, after they receive this government transfer, etc. And what we do in the survey is to do this cross-validation where we ask people what they would do in exactly this hypothetical situation, for which we know what not they themselves, but other people have done. And we see that the answers really align with the empirical estimates. And I explain this by saying that when you ask people about sort of daily decisions they're used to thinking about, you'll have a lot of predictive power, as opposed to when you ask them about things really out of the ordinary, like what will they do if they win the lottery, and for instance, and things like that. So that was my initial pitch for why we can, trust these answers. And the reason to use it is because we do not have all this variation in the data, right? In the data, you can't easily say, oh, you're getting a shock today versus in 2 quarters versus in 3 quarters. We don't have these experiments in the data that vary the size of the shock, the horizon, things like that. So I think this is where it's really valuable to know you can trust these survey responses, and now you can extrapolate it to all these scenarios that you would like to know about.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have one question, and maybe if there are other questions from the audience, please raise your hand. So in theoretical models, could be DSG, could be any other models, very theoretical, we can model this trade-off between deleveraging and the marginal propensity to consume. But you know, it's a model, and it's here you have the chance to have something true, to really touch the reality. And I'm wondering if you are able, with the data you have in hand, to determine exactly the striking point when we will switch to consume. When exactly? So should we have a depth of I don't know, 0, or should we have some savings to consume more than deleveraging? Where is the cutoff?
Yes.
If you can identify this cutoff, of course.
No, that's a good question. We haven't done that, so I don't have the answer for you here, but I think it would be possible with the data. And by the way, like, we'll be super delighted to share this data for, like, you know, for people to address other questions, because I think it is quite rich. There's all the balance sheets of households on the one hand, characteristics and past experiences, you know, concerns, goals, and then all these like hypothetical behaviors and reasons. So a question like this, which you're mentioning, is a very good one, you know, and we haven't done this, but I think it's a great idea.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any additional questions? Okay, so again, thank you very much. Congratulations for your Bats Clark medal won during the seminar. It's a crazy thing, but I have to say this. And we wish you best of luck for your research, your lab, and all of these fantastic papers and research you are conducting. Stefanie, thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for the comments and questions, and please don't hesitate to reach out if it's of interest. Thank you for your time.